Hello, this is your host of PoliTalks, Eric Hacopian, and we're very pleased to have with us today one of Armenia's leading experts on Turkish politics, Vahram Ter-Matevosyan, who is currently the chair of the Political Science Department at AUA, the American University, and he's a PhD from the University of Bergen in Norway. Professor Ter-Matevosyan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You recently published a book, so I want to give you a chance to tell people a little bit about it, what the topic is and what it covers.
Yes, last month my book was published by Palgrave Macmillan in New York and London. The book is about Turkey, Kemalism and the Soviet Union, the complex relations that went on between these two countries in the 1920s and 30s. So the book basically covers the external dimensions and interpretations of Kemalism, the founding ideology of Turkey, how the Soviet Union, how the Soviets interpreted this complex ideological construction in the Republican Turkey. And basically the book is trying to give an external interpretation of Kemalism. And so far the relations between the Soviet Union and Turkey has been looked through from the perspectives of bilateral relations and the complexity of bilateral relations of geopolitics, but never before scholars look into the dimensions of how the Soviet Union looked into the domestic developments in Turkey, the ideological processes that Mustafa Kemal initiated in the 1920s and 30s. So the book gives first-hand account how the diplomats, different emissaries and party functionaries from the Soviet Union looked into these different developments and how it was translated into the domestic discourse in the Soviet Union. And it also gives a holistic account how Kemalism as an ideology was developed in the 1920s, late 1920s and 30s, and all the way to 1970s. So it's the first time that these two accounts are brought together in these two books.
I'm very pleased you did this, and one of the most interesting things is that era, which is far less studied than the Cold War era between Turkish and Soviet relations, shaped the boundaries of where we're living in right now far more so than the Cold War ever did. So I'm surprised there hasn't been more attention to it. I'm going to come back to Kemalism as an ideology, but I want to come to more contemporary times. In March 30th, there's the municipal elections in Turkey, which are getting more attention than municipal elections have ever received. What do you think are the likely outcome of these elections, and what is it going to mean for the primary actor in Turkish politics, which is President Erdogan? What do you see happening on March 30th?
This is fourth municipal elections for Erdogan, and these elections are really important for a number of reasons. First of all, this is going to be the end of the election cycle for Erdogan, and the next
5 years, I believe, right?
The next elections are going to be held in 2023, and which basically means that Erdogan will have another 4 years to expand his power and consolidate it even more than he was able to do so far. But what is important to know about these elections is Turkey is approaching these elections as polarized as never before. So one of the reasons, of course, is the past deeds and events that Erdogan has been able to do in cooperation with the Nationalist Action Party, one of his allies in these elections. They have both created this People's Alliance as opposed to Nations Alliance. So these are the two polars of these elections. The other polar, I would say, it's the Kurdish parties, and we'll see how the election results will be. But before before we explain this, we have to we have to also be aware of the complex system that exists in Turkey in terms of local governance. So when on Sunday Turkish voters will go to the election polls, election centers, they have to elect number of people, number of officials, not only the heads of local governments, the elders, council of elders, but also the municipality leaders, the big councils of the big municipalities. So it's pretty complex system. So they get at least, depending on where they live, depending on the type of community they live, they will get at least 4 ballots, and they have to pick their candidates. And so it's pretty cumbersome process, I have to say. Well, yeah. When it comes to the favorites, I believe AKP will come along with MHP. They will be winning number of important election centers as places, but I believe the most crucial parties who will get Istanbul and Ankara. These two important places where AKP has been ruling from in Ankara, and at least from 1996, and in Istanbul from
2001.
From 2004. Yeah. So they have been basically AKP-run municipalities. But recently, last year, Erdogan asked the leaders of these, mayors of these two cities to resign because allegedly for fatigue. So they have. So he asked new blood to come in, and but it seems that this contest is going to be pretty tough, because according to recent polls, survey polls, it seems it's not going to be as easy as perhaps Erdogan was thinking back in February or in January. So it's we'll see how they will.
Well, thank you for that precise update. As we all, I know you're not an economist, but obviously the current crisis in Turkish politics is driven by the state of the economy. They have terrible inflation. The country is in a recession. And you have devaluation. You probably have further devaluations after the elections. You know, Erdogan has made controversial statements before about democracy. He said it's like a train. You know, once you get to your destination, you get off of it. There's a reasonable chance that the country enters into a period of economic crisis that's going to go on for a significant amount of time. Do you think this is an opportunity that Erdogan is going to use to become far more authoritarian, or essentially take what is a country that is becoming less and less democratic over time? Or is it something that's going to be his undoing, the events and the economic situation in the country currently?
Yeah, the economic slowdown or a downturn last August was unprecedented from a number of perspectives for the Turkish economies, and it affects also how the society perceived Erdogan and the way he governs the country. And but in addition to these domestic constraints, there are also foreign constraints and external issues that Erdogan has to cope with in order to overcome difficulties created after the economic downturn last year. And the voters will be going to the polls with new considerations in mind. It's not going to be an easy walk for Erdogan, but at the same time, Erdogan and his government, they've approached these elections again, basically using the same rhetoric as polarizing nationalist, conservative, religious rhetoric that they have been using, again trying to divide the society between goods and bads, between whites and blacks. And so this electoral hegemony that Erdogan has been able to consolidate for 2 decades, he'll be trying to use the same techniques for these elections also. But what needs to be also considered is how Erdogan is dealing with his allies, is the United States and Europe. It seems the situation is not improving. The relations between the United States and Turkey is not getting any better. Between the European Union and Turkey, the situation is, again, there is nothing that Erdogan can be proud of. Again, as a result, Turkey is, with its steps, it's moving more towards Russia, and which in return consolidates and maintains Russia's base in the Middle East, and having Turkey, an ally like Turkey, will of course be an important contribution to Russia's strategic calculations in this part of the world.
Well, I mean, that sort of leads to a question that I had for later, but I'm going to come back to this now, and that is the whole S-400 missile, the missile issue. I spoke to the NATO officials, and I don't understand the practicality of what it seems to me from any practical point of view. Erdogan does not need this. He can still have his relations with Putin and the Russians without doing something as disruptive as this, because it doesn't make sense on so many different levels. What is his obsession with this particular defense system, and is it, by any calculation, is this a winner for him in the big scheme of things? Why is this so valuable for him, a singular defense system in which any modern military has 50, 60 different, different military, different systems? What's the obsession with this issue? I understand the American side. You might not agree with them, but I know it's very clear why they come from where they come from and what they believe. But I don't see what Erdogan has to gain by this. What's his game plan here?
Well, it's only on the surface that it seems it's about the missiles, but it goes deeper than this. It's about the contradictions, never-ending contradictions between Turkey on the one side and NATO and Americans on the other side of this story. We need to keep in mind that the contradictions between Erdogan and the Americans, especially its NATO fellow members, started way ago, when back in 2012, Erdogan was complaining about the vulnerability of Turkish airspace from the attacks from the Syrian territory. And Turkey approached its NATO allies a few times asking for missile air defense systems. And first, the Europeans were able to deliver these launch pads in Turkey, but in 2015 they have removed. So Erdogan's concerns that he raised in 2012 were resurfaced again. Erdogan had to reach out for new partners, for new providers who could procure new missile air defense system, missile system, and S-400s were important and highly advanced missile systems. They are at this moment they are considered one of the best in the world, and as a result, it's a complex game that Turkey, if you look at the 20th century, has been doing quite ably, and they have been able for if you look at the history of Turkey, the 20th century, whenever they always benefit from the contradictions that exist between the West and Russia, and between the West and the Soviet Union. Whenever there were contradictions between these two polars, Turkey was always able to benefit from this. And this is another instance when we see how Turkey benefits from the contradictions that exist between Russia and the West, especially the Americans. Now, we all know that the Americans are vehemently opposed to the idea of acquiring S-400s, because they do not combine, they contradict the Patriot system, which is Turkey posed to acquire. But at the same time, it's not about the missile system. It's about how independent Turkey has become in terms of its own procurement, and acquiring its own missile systems. And understandably, that can they see the indications that the Turkey that they used to have in the 1990s, early 2000s, it's gone. It's different Turkey, which is difficult to deal with, and the Americans, but it comes as at a price, and the price is who is benefiting from Turkey's shifting of its axis, and of course the country that benefits from this is Russia, and this deep geopolitical rivalry that exists between the Russians and the Americans in the Middle East is heading towards the direction of that Russians are getting an upper hand with having more military, also technological presence, because S-400 is about 400 kilometer of controlling airspace, and that's a huge plus. So that's hence the name S-400. Yeah, and these are these missile launchpad systems can engage with multiple aerial targets, and these missile systems are able to change the entire architecture of the air defense system in this part of the world. The Americans have all the reasons to be concerned, but it seems Erdogan is pushing as much as he can, bringing the argument of the vulnerability of its security. So, but I have to also underline that when these systems are delivered into Turkey and they are officially launched, this is where we can count the end of this contradiction, because the fact that Americans are raising their concerns doesn't mean that Turkey will give up, or the vice versa. So until the last moment, we have to wait and see whether Turks will be able to acquire this.
Well, thanks for clarifying this, because it was obviously this is far more, as you ably stated, it's far more than just this particular issue. It's a symbolic issue of a far greater contradiction. Talking about something that's far more pertinent to Armenia, let's talk about Karabakh. To what extent is Turkey's relationship with Armenia over the past decade, I would say, since the protocols and the failure of them, to what extent is it held hostage by Azeri interests? And to what extent is it really held hostage by its own history of not being able to face the facts of its own history, and it's easier not to deal with Armenia because it opens up a can of worms that they don't want to deal with? There's always been speculation about financial interests that Erdogan's family has with the Alayevs, and as far as some of the extra reasons why they would be so subservient to Azeri interests. How do you see to what extent are they subservient to Azeris when it comes to the relationship with Armenia, or is it driven by other factors?
There are a number of layers in this question. This is a very important question, I have to say. First of all, what needs to be kept in mind when we analyze this very complex problem is that there are contradictions between Turkey and Azerbaijan, and these contradictions are not scrutinized as deep as they ought to under different circumstances. I think there are many potential issues that they were more acute back in late 2000s than they are now. Azerbaijan clearly has drawn some lessons from its past positions, from its past mistakes, and Azerbaijan has also increased its presence in the Turkish economy, in the media spheres also. I'm sure you're aware the recent public opinion poll that was conducted by one of the leading universities in Turkey, Kadir Has University, which identified Armenians as the third most dangerous enemies for Turks. So, and there hasn't been much discussion in Armenia where it's leading, where it is coming from. One of the reasons is the existing anti-Armenian propaganda and mood in Turkey. And you know, the Armenian question, whatever it comes under this umbrella, has disappeared from Turkish public discourse, from public discussions, and the word Armenia is almost non-existent in Turkey. and if they are, they're all only under negative connotations, and it mostly should be attributed to the role that Azerbaijan is playing in the Turkish information space. Going back to the question that you have raised, I think there are a number of issues at this level. First of all, yes, Turkey has been became subservient of Azerbaijani interests, but on the other hand, Turks stick to the original formula that they developed. That is, precondition, imposing precondition. And precondition was, as you know, normalizing relations with Azerbaijan or solving the Karabakh problem, only then normalization process. But this formula failed miserably in the case of Armenia. Armenians, on the other hand, had another formula, no preconditions, but this formula is outdated nowadays. Armenia should come up with a new formula, with a formula that is aimed at a different Turkey, which is a Turkey that is not the Turkey of the early 1990s. Turkey of nowadays has different preferences. The society itself has changed. It's become more conservative, and this line of rhetoric that Armenia used for 20, 30 years, now it needs to be revised, revisited, and new accents should be brought up in order to have another possible line of negotiation with Turkey. Of course, Armenia's position is that at this moment that there is no interest whatsoever from the Turkish side to have any contacts, to have any relations, but it should not discourage Armenian diplomats. Armenian diplomats and foreign ministries should seek any opportunity to try to open channels of communications with Turkey, because whatever is being done as of now is against Armenia's interest, and there is one country that clearly benefits from every passing day of not having normalized relations between Turkey and Armenia, and that is Azerbaijan. This current situation should not upset Armenia's authorities and Armenia's partners. They should raise the question of Armenia being under the blockade from Turkey for more than a quarter century in all possible platforms and forums. This is not, Turkey was able to stomach and to digest this geopolitical complexity that they have imposed on Armenia, and they got along with it. So now it's time to stop this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the aggressiveness of. You should always make the point and be aggressive about it. But there's also the flip side of this, and that is because of, first of all, economies by nature adjust. If a border is closed long enough, it doesn't exist, and this also means that Turkey has utterly no influence in anything that happens in Armenia, and it's the one neighbor that it has almost no influence in. Secondly, as the Turkish recession and the Turkish economic problems are spreading, they're impacting every country around Armenia except Armenia. You look at economic growth in Armenia compared to Georgia, the devaluation of the lira has impacted Georgia far more than it ever impacted Armenia. It has absolutely no impact in Armenia. So I think you're absolutely correct, but I don't think it's not a one-way streak anymore. That the more time passes, both parties lose. I don't think it's just one party that loses. I think people don't recognize that. You can take something like the railway. When you do the studies, it's a railway that's entirely paid for by the Azeris, going from nowhere to nowhere, and not carrying any cargo or anything, and supposedly it's to isolate Armenia. And in the 21st century, you don't isolate people with railways in the world of internet and all these things going on. I'm going to close with one last question, because I know this is your level of expertise. This is your specific expertise. And Kemalist ideology, ultra-nationalist, many things that come with it. In many ways, in what ways is it similar to the other post-World War I fascist ideologies, whether it's Mussolini, whether it's Franco, whether it's the German model? And to what extent is it different? And if my description of it is correct, is it fair to say that Turkey is the last unreformed post-World I fascist state in Europe? And many of the contradictions and the problems in society come from the fact that they've never dealt with detaching themselves from that ultra-nationalist ideology as something that holds the society together.
That's another great question, Eric. You know, the ideology of Kemalism, which is known for its 6 elements, these 6 elements are coming from different eras. Some scholars trace the roots of Kemalism as back as 18th century, some at the end of 19th century. But what was happening in the world, and particularly outside of Europe, in terms of ideological parallels with the interwar period, is a phenomenon which is called global fascism. Global fascism doesn't mean that it encompassed all the countries around the globe. It's just some features of fascism and Nazism, National Socialist ideology, that were able to move beyond Germany and Italy and have manifestations in different forms in different Romania, parts of the Romania, and as far north as Sweden even. So this was a very complex phenomenon that many scholars just didn't pay enough attention. They didn't see common patterns. And if we look at the problem from this perspective, we see that global fascism didn't bypass Turkey also, and Turkey, from the early 900s all the way to late 50s, we could see clear manifestations of global fascism inside Turkey. One chapter of my book is dedicated to this problem, the parallels between global fascism and Kemalism and the ideologies of young Turks, who could see clear similarities and clear parallels. And when it comes to the description whether current Turkey is another manifestation of this fascism regime, on many levels, yes. When it comes to, if we look at the Constitution of Turkey, Article 88 clearly states that any citizen of Turkey is a Turk. And all these kind of different legal provisions that exist in the Turkish legal system point to the fact that, yes, it seems the 1920s, the impact of 1920s, 1910s and early 1900s, the impact haven't disappeared. They're still there. They're still shaping the mindset of the Turkish political leadership. They are shaping the mindset of the educators, of the ideologues of Turkey, and I don't see the end of this road. The Turkish legal system is Turkic-centered, is the Turkification project that has been imposed in the 1910s and 20s is still around under different shape and construct. It didn't go away. And to some extent, in order to understand today's Turkey, we need to go at least the late 19th century in order to understand the roots of many conflicts and problems that exist in nowadays Turkey. If we try to analyze Turkey of nowadays from election to another election circle, it's a trap. The roots of the conflict, the roots of the current Turkey goes back at least to the late 19th century, where we can see many continuities and similarities and ruptures, of course, but the common thread is there. It's easy to identify, it's easy to see where it's heading.
Professor Ter-Matevosyan, it's been a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.